along with Elliott Abrams and a number of other neoconservatives, vociferously backed the Reagan administration policies. Now, I won't go into the weeds on Central America and Eastern Europe, but I will say that this is the first generation of neoconservatives that I think is more cautious than the second generation that emerged. The collapse of Eastern Europe and what's often forgotten, the rise of democracies in Central America, seems to the younger generation, led by Robert Kagan, as a blueprint for expanding democracy into the Middle East. So the second generation is led by William Kristol, Robert Kagan, later on Max Boot, a number of other neocons who take a very triumphalist view of the Cold War. They essentially ignore the fact that while Reagan did, in my view, play a critical role in helping to bring down communism, particularly rhetorically, that it was also the dissidents inside Eastern Europe who brought about the collapse of Eastern Europe, and that Eastern Europe did have a democratic heritage dating back for centuries. It was not a wasteland that Ronald Reagan simply single-handedly overthrew. So the triumphalist version of American history is first really sounded by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, calling it the end of history with a question mark. He wasn't willing to take a full stand on it. But the triumphalist brand of history then becomes fused by the late 1990s with a call for national greatness. This is David Brooks and William Kristol. Gone is the conceit that the neocons had played with but not fully embraced of a smaller federal government. Instead, the mission, according to Kristol and Brooks and Kagan, was greatness, valor, all these honor, these old-fashioned terms that the neoconservatives felt had been traduced in the late 1960s by the left and that the Democratic Party had also violated. They wanted to return to what they saw as the grandeur of the United States. And this meant, once 9/11 came, that they were able to, I think, sell this vision of grandeur to a receptive President Bush. Bush had been floundering in his presidency before 9/11. I doubt he would have been reelected if it had not occurred. Bush knew that if you want to be a president who grows down in history, you take bold strokes. And clearly 9/11, in a religious sense and in a strategic sense, he saw himself in many ways as the chosen man. And I think the neoconservative vision was tailor-made for him. And obviously, Vice President Dick Cheney also had come to embrace the view, the neocon view, to a large extent. I don't think he is a neocon, but we can discuss why Cheney came to have so many neocons on his staff and pushed for it so strongly. I'm sure there are a lot of views here. And one of the reasons, I think, is that at some level he must have felt that he had left the job unfinished in the early 1990s against Iraq. And I think that was also, to a degree, animating Paul Wolfowitz. And this is where we get back to the Jewish question for, I think, Feith and Wolfowitz and others.
Remind who was he?
Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, and Feith was his subordinate. And Feith was responsible for post-war Iraqi planning and has become largely ridiculed for his failure in that sphere. Both Feith and Wolfowitz were deeply shaped by the memory of the Holocaust. In the case of Paul, by his father, who had lost relatives. In the case of Feith, who told me that one way of studying the Holocaust in Israeli history was to get to know his own father, who by some miracle did manage to escape from Europe. So I think there was, for many of the neoconservatives, not all, there was this impulse to rectify a wrong. And particularly in Wolfowitz's case, it was the massacre of the Shiites after the first Gulf War, when the United States stood by and did nothing. So you have a concatenation of impulses coming to bear here. Today, neoconservatives have been widely assailed for their lurch into Iraq. And I think, in retrospect, there was both a mixture of hubris in the unilateralism with which the United States approached it, and also something of a sentimentalization of foreign policy. I cannot get away from the problem that the Holocaust presents. I don't have the solution, but for it to drive American foreign policy in this regard is, for me, something of a question mark, and something that both liberal hawks and conservatives have not really grappled with adequately. Today, of course, the neocons are widely ridiculed for their failure in Iraq. Had it gone successfully, of course, they would be hailed as national heroes, as I try to show in my somewhat counterintuitive history in the beginning. But the thing that bothers me the most today, despite some of the ridicule is of course excessive of the neocons, but the thing that bothers me is the overall lack of accountability and failure to examine on the part of the neocons what went wrong in Iraq. And when you have William Crystal being appointed an op-ed writer for the New York Times, you have a number of other neocons essentially arguing that Iraq is a huge success, is to me highly problematic. But to take it away from the personal sphere, my bottom line on the neocons is that despite the setbacks that they have experienced, they are not going away. They remain, somewhat to my amazement, a dominant force in the Republican Party. And I believe the 2008 presidential election will be played out on the terrain that the neocons have laid out, which is that the likely Republican candidate will charge that the Democratic candidate is too weak on foreign policy, too soft to defend America at its moment of greatest peril. The Democrats, by contrast, will argue that Iraq is that the war on terror needs to be relooked at, that it's been conducted catastrophically. I don't think there will be any middle ground in this debate, and I expect a harsh and invective-filled debate championed by the neocons on the one side and a motley mixture of liberal internationalists and dovish liberals on the Democratic side.
Jacob, thank you very much. This was a very optimistic presentation, very encouraging, particularly about the quality of advisors to Republican presidential candidates. And I have to say, if you look at the Hillary Clinton team, she also has her share of liberal interventionists and neocons. So in this regard, nobody is entirely pure. Grover.
Thank you. Grover Norquist. I run Americans for Tax Reform, a taxpayer group, but also chair a meeting in D.C., the center-right Wednesday meeting. We put 120 or more people together every Wednesday, try and keep the whole center-right talking to each other, aware of what everybody's doing. There are 45 state capital versions of this meeting and around the country. And some people have said that I play the role of Grand Central Station or somehow managing trains coming in and out. It's more mother hen, den mother, camp counselor, trying to keep a broad coalition together. And so you work with people who are focused on homeschooling or Second Amendment rights or having businesses left alone or taxpayers or people who are concerned about national security, talking to each other, working with each other, making sure everybody can play well together. And my job is usually to keep everybody working well together and keep them from kicking each other under the table and throwing things at each other. And I'm presented here with a book that tells me that some of my children are ugly and busy shoplifting. And I want to suggest that neocons play a role in the modern center-right coalition. I think the discussion of the day overplays that. And let me give you my definition of neoconservative. A neoconservative is somebody who's not comfortable being in the Democratic Party. They're uncomfortable being in the Democratic Party for any number of reasons, and they don't understand economics. They're people who left the modern Democratic Party because of the Democratic Party's movement on social issues, Bill Bennett, and so on, people concerned about the 1960s. You have people who felt they were kept out of leadership or couldn't advance or weren't invited to the right parties, or they were punished for political correctness. They were repelled by the modern Democratic Party, and they thought that was the party that they had grown up in. And for the younger people, they were just repelled by the party. They may never have been in it, but they're repelled. They may be repelled because they think the Democratic Party took national security vis-a-vis the Soviet Union unseriously. But there are lots of people like that. Ronald Reagan fit into that category, but he understood economics and simply became a Republican. Neocons are people who said, I can't stand being in the room with the Democrats and there's a little checklist of reasons, all fine reasons. There are many good reasons to leave the modern Democratic Party. But then when they walk over towards the Republican side, they don't understand economics and they don't fit in. Millions of Americans over the last 20, 30 years have made that transition seamlessly without tripping at the doorway. And part of when you read about people who came from Scoop Jackson's staff or people who consider Scoop Jackson a model, you understand that these are people who truly don't understand anything about economics. Scoop Jackson's reaction to increases in oil prices was to nationalize the oil industry. This isn't, it just doesn't get any stupider than that, any greater lack of understanding of the way the world works. And yet you have people who can distinguish colors and count to high numbers and went to universities, but don't understand the idea of opportunity cost, who don't understand the role that prices play in a free market, who don't understand what free markets are, and you understand why they can be somewhat confused and end up not understanding incentives, secondary effects, unintended consequences, all the things that you'd understand if you knew something about economics. Let me just a couple of observations. One, the neocons find the Republican Party, the modern center-right, uncomfortable for a number of reasons. Apart from not understanding what the rest of us are talking about when we talk about prices and marginal taxes and free trade. But they also are going into a party that doesn't have, they want to be public intellectuals. And I think you've got like 25 people in your book, okay? You can't take over the country unless you're planning on working the airports and the radio stations with 25 people. And so you need a broader movement than that. But you got 25 people, they want to be public intellectuals. The modern center-right movement for a commercial republic doesn't have a lot of use for public intellectuals. The Reagan Republican Party knows what it wants to do. We want to have lower taxes and let everybody have school choice. We'd like to privatize Social Security and let everybody have as many guns as they want and run their own lives and go to whatever church, synagogue, or mosque they want to. And we've got a whole list of things to do, and we don't need an intellectual to come in and go, oh, no, no. One public intellectual recently announced, we really don't need to cut taxes anymore. Well, if you're trying to come up with new ideas to write op-eds and so on, you come up with ideas like that. But you run into a brick wall of reality when the center-right does too want to cut taxes again. What are you talking about? Every Republican running for president's opening bid is a $2 trillion tax cut. But somebody's idea is that we're no longer in. Giuliani's up at $6 trillion, I'm sorry. $6 trillion tax cut, Giuliani. $5 trillion Thompson, $2 trillion opening bid. Everybody's up at least $2 trillion. So a group of public intellectuals that want to play a role in the modern Republican Party is going to tell businessmen what that they don't already know, is going to reshape what. So it's uncomfortable. Two, as pointed out in the book, neocons bringing their immediate family members don't bring 100 people to the polls. And this is a democratic republic, and you need to bring votes to the polls. Neocons, as discussed, people unhappy with the Democratic Party but don't understand economics. don't bring anyone to the polls. They don't have something, yes, let's do that, and go vote for it, including national greatness.